I was struck by what a bright and beautiful girl she was. She said, well, to tell you the truth, I had an assignment, which was to interview Albert Schweitzer, and I skipped it and went out with you. So I had to marry her.
Close your eyes and picture a face that could define dignity itself. For generations, that face belonged to Gregory Peck. Tall, calm, and impossibly magnetic, he carried something rare, a timeless presence that demanded attention without a word. Behind that steady gaze and measured voice was quiet strength, a moral compass that never shouted, and a heart that loved fiercely. More than once, more than the world ever knew. Some loves vanished into shadow, others whispered from the corners of memory. Yet, as his life drew to its close, one truth shone brighter than all. One woman, and one woman alone, had captured his heart completely. Long before the fame, the accolades, and the world's gaze, there was a different life, a quieter life. And in that life, one woman burned brighter than any spotlight, Greta Kukkonen. Their paths met in a world full of uncertainty, of fragile possibilities, a world where destiny waited quietly for two hearts to collide. Before the world knew his name, Gregory Peck was just a man searching for himself. Ambition tugged at him, doubt shadowed him, and in the quiet of that early life, Greta stood as his anchor. Composed, intelligent, unshaken by glamour, she loved the man behind the rising star, not the star itself. Their marriage was a promise of the life he dreamed of, grounded, private, built not on applause, but on understanding. For a time, it worked. They built a family, they shared years before Hollywood's glare reached them, years untouched by expectation, raw and real. But success has a way of shifting tides. As Gregory's star ascended, so did the demands. Endless shoots, relentless attention, a subtle emotional distance neither could name, yet both could feel. It didn't arrive in a storm, it crept in like a whisper. Conversations grew brief, silences stretched long. Somewhere between who he was and who he was becoming, something fragile began to unravel. Some distances start not with anger, but with quiet. By the time the world embraced Gregory Peck, the life he had imagined, steady, simple, certain, was already slipping through their fingers. And though they couldn't know it yet, this was only the opening chapter of a far deeper, far more complicated story of love. By the time Gregory Peck stepped onto the set with Ingrid Bergman, he was no longer just the young actor finding his footing. He had become a presence, calm, deliberate, quietly commanding. And Ingrid Bergman, she was something entirely different. Her performances carried a kind of emotional intelligence that didn't just tell a story, it unraveled the soul. When they met on Spellbound, something rare flickered between them. Not loud, not flashy, but undeniable. A magnetic tension lived in the way they looked at each other, in the pauses that hung longer than dialogue, in a quiet chemistry audiences felt but could never fully name. Both carried the weight of expectation, the pressure of Hollywood's gaze. Both knew what it meant to perform while guarding the private self. Their connection wasn't about headlines or dramatic declarations. It lived in fleeting glances, in conversations that stretched quietly, in silences that felt full, in a rhythm shared only between them. It was a bond that whispered rather than shouted, a subtle understanding in a world obsessed with spectacle. And yet, as life often does, the world outside would never pause to notice. Ingrid Bergman moved forward, carried by a life that would soon pull her far from that fleeting moment. Gregory Peck, still untangling the quiet complexities of his own world, moved forward as well. Whatever flickered between them stayed suspended, unspoken, unclaimed. Some connections are never meant to last. They exist only to haunt memory. For Peck, it was another chapter in a story he was still learning to read, a lesson in desire, in restraint, in the dangerous edges of what love could be and what it could never become. Then came Barbara Payton. By the early 1950s, Gregory Peck had become a symbol of measured strength, on screen and off. His presence radiated discipline and emotional steadiness audiences trusted. But life doesn't always follow the rhythm of control. Barbara Payton existed to disrupt it. Where Peck was quiet, she was fire. Where he measured every word, she hurled hers like lightning. Her life left a trail of chaos, headlines and defiance, boundaries unknown, rules unmade. And perhaps that was the pull. Their connection never fit neatly into labels. It wasn't stability. It wasn't promises whispered in the dark. It lived in flashes, brief, electric, impossible to pin down. For a man like Peck, whose world thrived on control, she was disorienting and intoxicating. Not love exactly, but close enough to leave its mark. Some people don't mirror who we are. They illuminate what we cannot yet grasp within ourselves. Barbara Payton stood in that shadow, and the world caught only glimpses, rumors, fragments, a story too wild to match the carefully constructed image of Gregory Peck. But beneath those fleeting moments lay a quieter truth. Even the most polished lives hold fragments that refuse to fit neatly. It didn't last. It couldn't. Some connections aren't meant to endure. They exist only to teach. For Peck, this brief chapter became a lesson in contrasts, a reminder that not every magnetic connection leads to permanence, and not every intensity is destined to stay. Grace, distance, what never was. Audrey Hepburn. Certain encounters in life never fully bloom, yet their echo lingers longer than those that do. When Gregory Peck met Audrey during the making of Roman Holiday, he was already a man whose name carried weight. She, by contrast, was stepping tentatively into a light that would soon transform everything. From the first instant, she wasn't just beautiful. She possessed a rare, quiet elegance, a natural grace that drew attention without ever demanding it. Peck noticed it immediately, so much so that he fought for her name to share equal billing in the film, a gesture almost unheard of for a newcomer. Words couldn't have spoken more. Between them, there was warmth, admiration, and a subtle intimacy that never crossed its invisible boundaries. On screen, their chemistry sparkled. Off-screen, it was softer, unspoken, and carefully contained. Timing, as it often does, had its own rules. Peck was navigating the entanglements of his own life. Audrey was only beginning hers. Both seemed to understand, without ever saying it, that this connection belonged to a single moment, not a shared future. And yet, some moments leave indelible marks. Some people never enter our lives fully, but somehow they shape who we become. Not every love story is meant to be lived. Some are meant only to be felt, lingering in the spaces between what was and what could have been. For Gregory Peck, Audrey Hepburn wasn't a tale of heartbreak or struggle. She was a quiet lesson, a reminder that the most profound connections are often the ones we leave untouched, already perfect in their fleeting existence. And then there was Ava Gardner, the woman who lived without rules, without restraint, without apology. By the time Peck had fully claimed his place among Hollywood's most admired figures, he had already tasted many kinds of connection, some steady, some uncertain, some quietly unfinished. But Ava? She was nothing like anyone else. Where others carried elegance, she carried fire. Where others bent to expectation, she moved in freedom. A presence impossible to tame, a spirit that refused hesitation. She lived loudly, openly, with a passion that made the world seem smaller around her. In a universe defined by discipline and careful choices, Ava Gardner was chaos made beautiful, and for Peck, that chaos was magnetic. There was curiosity, admiration, maybe even a fleeting wonder of what it meant to move unburdened by rules. Yet some people don't enter our lives to stay. They enter to show us a rhythm we can't fully claim, a freedom we can't completely live, but one we can never forget. Their paths collided in a world built of lights, cameras, and unspoken expectation. Yet Ava's presence reminded him that some of life's brightest moments are meant to pass, not to be held. Yet emotionally, they were worlds apart. Peck remained the man he had always been, measured, reflective, contained. Ava Gardner was fire incarnate, untamed, instinctive, impossible to predict. Not every connection is meant to align. Some exist only in tension, in contrast, and maybe that was the truth between them. Ava never became the centerpiece of Gregory Peck's heart. She was a lesson, a spark, a force he could respect and then quietly let go. Because deep down, his heart was already nudging him elsewhere. Enter the woman who would change everything, Veronique Passani. By the time Peck met her, his life had been shaped by fleeting thrills, steady comforts, and connections that faded like shadows at dusk. But Veronique was different from the very first moment. She wasn't an actress, not drawn to lights or applause. She came from a world outside his own, grounded, perceptive, someone who didn't compete with his life but understood it completely. With her, there were no masks, no performance. He didn't have to carry the weight of expectation. After everything he'd seen, after all the intensity and chaos, maybe this was exactly what he needed. Their bond didn't burn bright, it settled, quietly, naturally. Conversations that lingered, presence that comforted, a stillness that spoke louder than any grand gesture. For the first time in years, there was clarity. No confusion, no contrast, no distance, just truth. Some loves don't arrive with noise. Some love arrives like dawn. They didn't arrive by chance. They arrived like destiny, unavoidable, undeniable. Not a spark, not a whim, a certainty. And the moment their lives intertwined, it was clear this wasn't another chapter. This was a quiet revolution, a turning point in a life that had known admiration, curiosity, even fleeting passion, but never understanding like this. Veronique Passani didn't represent a moment, she represented home. The world might not have seen it, they might have whispered, wondered, missed it entirely, but Gregory Peck didn't hesitate. He saw everything. He saw her, and in her the love that refused to fade. In the final stretch of his life, when ambition had softened, memories blurred, and the weight of decades had settled, Gregory was no longer defined by applause, accolades, or the roles he had played. What remained was simpler, more profound. Not fame, not legacy. Love. Steady, unshakable, undeniable love. He had known countless connections in his life, the fire of youth, the thrill of curiosity, the tension of contrasts, but each had burned out, leaving only one behind, Veronique Passani. She wasn't a chapter, she was the end of the search. Their life together needed no fireworks, no drama, no proof. It needed patience, understanding, quiet loyalty. It simply existed, breathed deeply, endured. In her, Gregory found the still center of everything he had been chasing, and finally, at last, he could rest. Through every twist of fate, every storm, every quiet dawn, she was there. Not as a shadow behind him, but as a force that moved with him, steady and unshakable. The kind of presence you feel in your bones, in the choices you make, in the silence between heartbeats. That is the difference. True love doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand applause, it simply remains. And in the hush of his final reflections, whether whispered to himself or understood in the marrow of his being, Gregory Peck knew this with absolute certainty. After every person, every fleeting moment, every winding path his life had carved, there was only one woman who had ever truly held his heart. Not for a single scene, not for a passing season, but for the entirety of his story. In the end, that was all that mattered. Gregory Peck's life wasn't measured by the roles he played, the stages he lit, or the eyes that watched him. It was measured by the love he chose to keep. Not every connection survives, not every feeling endures, but sometimes, quietly, without spectacle, one soul endures. And perhaps as you pause on his story, you'll see your own reflection, someone who stayed or someone who slipped away. Because in the end, we are remembered not for the breadth of our days, but for the depth of what we never let go.